swirling their wands around in circles, and up in the sky, a swirl of clouds started forming. The swirl got bigger and bigger until it covered the whole sky. Then there was a flash of lightning and a clap of thunder, and suddenly the clouds erupted with rain. Quickly shouted the princesses, "Everyone, open your mouths, stick out your tongues." And everyone stuck out their tongues and started gulping. They gulped and they gulped, and their tummies got fuller and fuller of water, until they were all so full of water, they all got terrible hiccups. Then they ran over to the queen. They lifted their arms up in the air and they shouted, "Hooray for the queen!" But the queen said, "No time for cheering now, my friends. Look where we are." And they turned around, and lo and behold, there they stood before the gates of Mordor. They had reached their destination. They knew those goblins were in there, and they knew they were going to have a fight. So the king said, "Princesses, you better get behind me, and knights and dwarf, you better come stand right here next to me, shoulder to shoulder." So the knights and the king stood there with the princesses behind them, and in the gates of Mordor, the goblins stood up too. They walked over to their gate, and at 10 o'clock that morning, let's have the gate be right about here, goblins. At 10 o'clock that morning, the gates of Mordor opened, and there stood the goblins. And you know what the goblins did? They lifted their right legs up in the air and stood there on one leg for a long time. And then, suddenly, they took one step towards the good knights. Then they took another step. A third step. Everyone lifted their swords. One tense moment, they stared at each other. Then the battle began. It was the worst battle ever fought in Middle-earth. It was called the Battle of Five Armies, and remember to fight in slow motion. All right, you can start now. Look at that battle. Oh dear, the princesses, they were worried about the knights again. Uh-oh, what's going to happen to those knights? Those goblins are pretty fierce. But then the princesses had an idea. They lifted up their magic wands, and without stepping forward, they pointed them at the goblins. Well, warm golden lightning came surging out of their wands, and can you guess what happened? The goblins started to shrink. The goblins got smaller and smaller. Pretty soon, they were so little, the good knights couldn't see them anymore. They looked everywhere. "Where did those goblins go?" they said. "They were just here." Then the knights gave up and walked over to the princesses and said, "Oh, princesses, excuse us, but we knights do believe that perhaps you may have shrunk those goblins a little too small. We were just fighting them, and now they've disappeared. Is there any chance you could make them a little bit bigger again?" "Sorry," said the princesses, "we'll try." And they pointed their wands again, swirled them the other way, and sure enough, those goblins started to grow bigger again. "There they are," said the knights. The goblins stepped forward once more. The knights walked toward them. The goblins walked toward the knights. But just when they were about to start fighting, the goblins kept growing bigger. "Oh dear," said the knights, "they're getting too big." It was true. They were so good, they could easily step on the knights. It looked like it was all over for everyone, when suddenly everyone froze, and nobody could move a muscle. Because there out of nowhere appeared Yavanna in the form of a unicorn. She swooshed her horn through the air, and everyone's swords and axes just dropped right out of their hands. Then she swooshed her horn through the air again, casting a friendship spell over everyone in Middle-earth. So all the princesses and the knights and the dwarf ran over to the goblins and started shaking hands with them. It was working. They shook hands, then they gave them big hugs, and then an even more amazing thing happened. For all at once, everyone's hands went shooting up over their heads. And would you believe it? They all started hopping up and down and swirling around in circles. Around and around they went, faster and faster, until suddenly the king said, "Hold on there, goblins. Aren't we forgetting something?" "Oh, you're quite right," said the goblins. And they went running back to the land of Mordor and picked up the treasure bag that they'd stolen. Yes, the goblin went over there, picked it up, then ran back over to the king, plopped the treasure bag at the king's feet, and fell on her knees. "Please, your majesty," said the goblin, "you must forgive me. And the king said, "Well, Goblin, you don't suppose any of this sort of nonsense will ever happen again, do you?" "Oh, no," said the Goblin. "I'll never do that again. I'll never steal any treasure. I found something I like doing much better than that." "Oh, what's that?" said the king. "Well, I'll teach it to you," said the Goblin. "I call it the Happy Goblin Dance." And she hopped up and started doing the funniest little dance you ever saw. "Never mind her. Just start doing your own thing," said the Goblin. And everyone started doing their own thing, started wiggling their arms and their legs, and doing the funniest dance you've ever seen. "So that's how you do it," said the Goblin. "I call it the Happy Goblin Dance." Then they started swirling around in circles, too. Whatever the Goblin did with her arms, that's what they did with their arms. Whatever she did with her legs, they copied that. And they danced like this for 3 hours. No, 3 days. And finally, everyone was so happy, they just couldn't help themselves. They lifted their arms up in the air. And they turned toward the audience, and they took a great big bow. Ladies and gentlemen, let's hear a big cheer for these wonderful actors and actresses. We'd like to thank you all for putting on such a great show for all those millions of people out there. And before you go, we've got one other surprise, because you see the stage that you were just performing on, the grass here, it's been surrounded by 4 video cameras, and we just made a movie of the very performance you put on. So if you want to, you can actually buy a DVD of your very own performance. If you'd like a smaller souvenir, we've also got some little magic unicorn horns that come straight from the forest of Rivendell. We thank you all for coming with us to Middle Earth. Thank you.